So the debate is part of a series that we're starting with the SMS Global Strategy Interest Group. It's the first one of the series. And the idea is to bring more tangibility to research and grand challenges and connect it further to practice. So today's debate, we've chosen a topic that is a huge phenomenon right now, is being spoken about all the time. We see this being discussed in the news almost daily. So this is on the voluntary carbon market. In terms of the agenda for the session, so as mentioned, I'll do a quick introduction. Then we'll have 45 minutes to debate the motion. The motion is voluntary trading of emission credits is an efficient or effective way to reduce the rate of climate change. And we have three incredible debaters here with us today. I'll introduce them quickly. And the way we've set up this debate is that we have Dr. Florian Hieb, who will debate for the motion that trading can be useful under certain conditions. Marco Montefiore, who'll debate against the motion that trading itself is not productive. And then we have Dr. Andrew King, that conditions for success are possible but difficult to achieve. And the way we'll run this debate is that each one of the debaters will present first their position, 7 minutes more or less, and then we'll actually have a rebuttal. Each one will get to give their second opinion after hearing everybody else, and then we'll actually open it up to you. And we have quite an intimate group today, so we'll have a 35 minutes to actually have Q&A and discuss this further. And of course, the main idea is not just to debate, but also to learn, to explore new ideas, and to see what we can elevate out of having so many experts here today. So I'll just briefly introduce the debaters. So we have two academics and one practitioner. Marco Montefiore is a former energy trader for the last 20 years, and he's recently written a book called Energy Citizenship, where he discusses how energy and the role of energy is implicating society today. We have Dr. Florian Hieb. Florian is assistant professor of sustainable finance in Frankfurt at the Leibniz Institute for Financial Research and the Goethe University. He's also a research affiliate at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and in the past has also worked with South Pole, who I think most of us know, and is also on the board of ESG-AM. And of course, we have Dr. Andy King. Andy is the Alan and Kelly Quastrom Chair in Strategy and Innovation at the Quastrom School of Business and Boston University. So I want to thank our panelists, and I'll switch to you after my brief introduction. Well, we've had a summer of preparing for this, and we've had quite a few discussions already on this topic. So it's been already very exciting for us to even prepare for this debate. So thank you to the three of you. Now, the framing. So I come very much from Grand Challenges research background. The Grand Challenges are complex problems with significant implications, unknown solutions. They're intertwined, evolving, and evolve technical and social interactions. And what we found in our research is that innovation can be a way to solve these grand challenges. Now, in order to make this type of research more tangible, we decided to focus on one specific grand challenge, and that is climate change. So this is difficult to solve. It's a huge problem, and it's going to have major implications on the world. Now, one innovative solution for climate change is actually pricing. So can you put a price on carbon? And so this came out of, and I'll give you a brief history, but the UNFCCC, this is the United Nations Framework for Climate, I believe, in 1992, was discussing that pricing could be an issue. Now, could be a solution. Now, if pricing is a solution, markets can be one way to allocate pricing. And relevant markets include compliance or voluntary markets. Today, we've really decided to narrow it down and discuss voluntary carbon markets. So this is our framing. This is what we selected, and this is specifically what we'll discuss today. So what are the voluntary carbon markets? These are mechanisms that allow individuals, businesses, organizations to buy and sell carbon credits to offset their footprint. There's a huge debate ongoing in the world, not just today in our screens in front of you, but actually this is a major debate as to whether this is an effective and transparent way to address climate change. Just very briefly, the benefits that come with voluntary carbon markets is that they can incentivize emission reductions, they can channel climate finance, and they can support further sustainable development. Now, the critics, the challenges that they raise is that often these can be linked to greenwashing, they lack regulation, there's no compliance still, and there's questions about the additionality and permanence of carbon offsets. So today we'll really debate the nuances and the roles of voluntary carbon markets in addressing the grand challenge of climate change. So I mentioned already what this is. So it's a system where you can buy and sell carbon credits to offset your carbon emissions. These carbon credits represent the reduction of or removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And by participating in these voluntary carbon markets, entities can take an active role in mitigating their environmental impact. This is not a new topic. It's been ongoing since the 1980s, but in recent years, we've really seen a rise. Many times when you discuss the voluntary carbon markets, you'll hear people discussing the Paris Agreement, where there was a global goal set to below 2 degrees. And then we had a big proponent from the former government of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who launched the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets to increase the transparency and integrity of that market. Often you'll hear people discussing COP26 in Glasgow, which really recognized the crucial role of the voluntary carbon markets in achieving net zero emissions. And then since then, you've had a few more. So the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets was established in 2022. And slowly over the last 2 years, you've really seen a rise in the discussion on this topic. Here's the big quote from Mark Carney: "Voluntary carbon markets can help drive climate action and finance, but they must be designed and implemented carefully to ensure integrity and avoid unintended consequences." So this is a quote that often people refer to when they're discussing this topic. Now, I mentioned that over the last 2 years, there's been quite a rise in the voluntary carbon market, and we've seen a lot of innovations. Blockchain, for example, is trying to enable more transparency. There's AI and machine learning and carbon accounting, for example. You have nature-based solutions marketplaces. So you see quite a bit of innovation, including now people discussing tokenization of carbon credits. So this is all ongoing. The discussion is very relevant today. It's a phenomenon that's really at the forefront of a lot of what's going on. And I think today what's really important is that we bring in this discussion to strategy and management scholars as well. So to end my introduction now, I'll just restate the motion and move to Florian, and he will be discussing the pro side of this motion. So it's voluntary trading of emission credits is an effective or efficient way to reduce the rate of climate change. So without any further ado, as mentioned, we'll each have the debaters present 7 minutes, and then we'll do a rebuttal and then the Q&A. So thank you very much, Florian. I hand it to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Catherine, for the introduction. I will briefly share my slide. So what I would like to add to this discussion is really kind of adding some thoughts on why I think voluntary carbon markets are an interesting topic to think about, to do research about, I mean, from an academic perspective, but also from a practitioner perspective on the client perspective. I have the pro role in this debate. My personal view is probably a bit more nuanced, but I try to convince you that this is really an interesting topic and it's the right point in time to be thinking about voluntary carbon markets. So, I mean, why do we need voluntary carbon markets to start with, right? I mean, you may have seen this graph. It's from the IPCC. So the good news is when we have a global agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. But the bad news is, despite these global commitments, countries' abilities to implement policies that actually implement these targets it seems to be limited. So in red, you can see kind of the current projections of where the policies we have right now will bring us. And I mean, maybe we'll stabilize emissions, but we're far off from reaching the emission reductions we need to limit global warming to more or less harmless limits. So there's many reasons, but a main reason is that we know the policy tools, right? We can have carbon pricing, PGU taxes, cap and trades. There's a whole set, but often these policies fail to find political majorities to get them implemented. As I said, politics is complex. It's hard to find majorities for things that cost certain people and make life harder. So we have this gap, right, between the policies and where we should need to go. And I think voluntary carbon markets is one part how the private sector could potentially help to fill the gap that we currently cannot fill with more stringent policies. Now, let us for a minute talk about kind of size of this market and volumes. I mean, on this graph, you can see, I think that's the big number. We are currently something like 50 to 60 gigatons of carbon emissions per year, so quite a large sum. The voluntary carbon market in the past, so this whole system of voluntarily trading emission reductions, has been very small, right? So if you look here at scale, that's some market numbers, how the market has developed from 2005 to recently. I mean, there has been boom and bust cycles, but volumes have never really exceeded 500 megaton a year. So that's 0.5 gigatons. So that's a teeny tiny fraction of our general emissions. So I think one very important point is, if we think about carbon markets right now, I think the most of the interesting discussion is about the future of carbon markets, not what we've seen in the past, but where these markets might go. So there's been quite a number of market studies and projections and scenarios by different providers like Bloomberg, McKinsey, Trove Research, and others, kind of estimating where these markets will go. And all kind of these market research firms, they think voluntary carbon markets will explode in the future, especially if we kind of zoom into this 2050 target of net zero. So according to some estimates, voluntary carbon markets could be up to 13 gigatons a year, which is then more like a fourth of current global emissions. So this could be massive. So I think it's worth thinking about how could this work in the future. And I think also important is to think about, to understand what is driving this future prediction of the size of voluntary carbon markets. And I think it's mainly that private sector action, or at least claims of private sector actions, have been increasing. So more and more companies set net zero targets. And here I just plotted the most current numbers of the Science-Based Target Initiative. I would say the most stringent target setting body, kind of describing how companies should go about when they set net zero targets that are compatible with current scientific evidence. And as you can see, I mean, this is rising for 2024. We only have like half-year data in, so that the real number will be way above 10,000. So corporate net zero commitments are currently exponentially growing. And so companies will have a lot to do to reach net zeros as they claim. I think that's where kind of the expected demand for carbon credits in the future comes from mainly, right? And so I think it's worth thinking some minutes about kind of what does net zero mean for net zero commitments mean for carbon markets. And I think one very important thing, if you talk about voluntary carbon markets in this debate, is that we need to differentiate between two fundamentally different types of carbon credits, right? Reduction credits and removal credits. The idea behind reduction credit is that we have some activity in the real world, like, for example, coal-powered electricity that we try to reduce by another technology, for example, a wind power plant. So this is not really taking carbon out of the atmosphere, but with financing some project that needs financing because it's not viable alternatively, we reduce kind of carbon emissions against the counterfactual of what would have happened without these projects. I mean, this has been the majority of current markets, mainly renewable energy, but also avoided deforestation. They're roughly, I would say, 90% of the volumes in current markets we're seeing. There's also some household things like small-scale cook stores, but currently it's mainly renewables and body deforestation. I think, but most participants of the markets would agree the market will or needs to go to removals, really taking out carbon off the atmosphere. There's technical air carbon capture mineralization, but also nature-based solutions like improved forest management or soil carbon enhancement in the agricultural system. So I think we see a shift in this direction, and most of the projected demand is actually in the removal space. And currently, we don't have many projects there. So it's really about where this market will go. And as I mentioned, right, the demand mainly comes from these net zero targets. So it's it's interesting to think about where do these carbon credits sit in these corporate commitments on net zero targets. And I think there's more and less controversial roles carbon credits can play in corporate net zero targets. I think the least controversial thing is that I think somewhere in the future we will need carbon removal credits or carbon removals to kind of offset residual emissions of companies. So some things will be really hard to decarbonize, some direct scope 1 emissions. I think it's kind of companies need to still, if they want to pay net zero, they need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I think then is scope 2 kind of electricity. So, I mean, this is quite established, but there's a lot of debate on the rules. So these are also, they're not carbon credits, but they were pretty similar, actually. I think the debate we're having right now is mainly about scope 3. So should companies be allowed to use carbon credits to decarbonize their supply chains? I mean, there's many, I mean, on average, I think 75% of corporate emissions lie within their upstream and downstream supply chains. And these are kind of often complex. So it's really hard to really through the entire supply chain decarbonize every single supplier. So why shouldn't we move to more efficient tools, saying it doesn't really matter whether you decarbonize your own supplier. You can also decarbonize the supplier of your competitor and get a certificate for that. So I think this is the entire gains of trade argument, right? Instead of focusing of only on your own thing, we could focus on reducing carbon emissions in a broader set of opportunities. And I think this is also where the innovation element comes in, right? If you have demand for carbon reduction credits in the entire global economy, this creates incentives for innovative solutions that may not be captured by regulation immediately, but can be captured by these carbon markets to help companies to reduce their scope 3 emissions. I say that's certainly not uncontroversial. There's been a lot of debate about the Science Based Targets initiative, has been very critical on the use of carbon credits. In a very surprising action, the board of the Science Based Targets initiative, so this standard setting body this spring, has released a statement that was way more positive on the use of carbon credits for offsetting some scope 3 emissions. This had triggered an entire debate. So, and a lot of media attention. I think that's where the debate stands right now. So I think it's a really interesting point in time to discuss this thing. So coming back, our proposition, I mean, voluntary carbon markets can play an important role. I think certainly for creating a market for carbon removal, potentially also enabling companies to decarbonize their supply chain efficiently, right? But I would add a big but, and I think we can also discuss this, right? There has been a lot of critiques on current projects on additionality, measurement, and performance. So I would enhance the motion by they can play an important role if we can create institutions that make these markets really work. Good. So that's it from my side for the first rounds. I'm looking forward to Marco's thoughts.
Thank you, Florian. Okay, so I won't interject anything there. I'll move directly to Marco, and Marco's position is going to be more on the trading itself is not productive angle. So Marco, I move to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katia. Thank you, Florian. So as a disclaimer as well, this conversation is for the purpose of a debate, which is built on purpose to present a complex topic in very simplified terms and polarizing terms. I personally, last year, planted 500 plants in my garden. I take public transport every day, so I'm quite conscious of the importance of pollution in general, climate change, etc. So what I'm presenting, what I'm about to present, does not necessarily reflect correctly my thinking, but it's basically the why voluntary carbon markets are most likely going to fail. And so let's start to rewind a little bit, building on what Catherine said at the beginning, the history of carbon markets. Carbon markets have been around for at least 2 decades with a very questionable performance. the early investors got completely burned, and then there was a second wave of enthusiasm. At the core of the second wave is the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement has been conceived, built, and signed within the UN. And there is basically a push to build a mechanism, an artificial mechanism, an artificial markets, where players can create schemes to avoid or reduce carbon emission, right? So it is a UN conceived sort of project to create something completely artificial. We know that markets historically have been around for thousands of years, with or without the existence of currencies as a barter or something. So whenever there is a need to transfer goods from one party to the other, the market is a social phenomenon naturally forms. Here we are trying to engineer something, and the question is, has it been successful so far? Does it really make sense? And the purpose of this conversation is to understand whether it will help with the climate change, mitigating the risks of climate change, right? So let's look at the 1 second. Okay, so let's do a reality check. 9 years later, we see a question of is it legitimate still, right? We have the UN itself that is attacking companies' reliance on carbon credits to achieve their climate targets. There is a distortion in the behaviors that these markets are creating. Corporations are trying to offset rather than reduce. If you offset, essentially what you do is you push your own problem to someone else down the line, and you care less because you have ticked the box, right? This is a fact that prompted the same institution that has been pushing and conceived this whole scheme to remark this. It's quite relevant. Then are the voluntary carbon markets actually have they reached a critical mass? And if we look at the numbers, at the proportions, the latest reports show that voluntary carbon markets not only is a fragmented market, so you have several sub-markets within it, but it represents 2% of the total carbon trade, where 99% is the compliance market, right? So it might have a future, but if it does have a future, it's unlikely to see the voluntary carbon market becoming shifting in terms of relevance, given the size and the prominence and the preference for market participants to operate in the compliance market. Then there are some structural issues, right? When you launch a market, you hope it becomes global to make it smooth and efficient, but the voluntary carbon market is almost a bilateral type of market, so it's unlikely to become global, like the compliance market is not global, because each jurisdictions has developed its own regulation and mechanisms, etc. Then you have every contract in a market needs to have an underlying asset, right? Which is the ability to handle, to store emissions. And this, first of all, the right to pollute or the ability to store is an intangible, very difficult to measure concept, right? There can be lots of fluctuation. You cannot measure it continuously. The concept of representative sampling is very hard. The quality of the output of emissions can fluctuate, and so the quality of the storage, depending on the weather conditions, etc., etc. Then you have natural events like fires that can destroy the underlying asset. And as much as the schemes, factor in these risks, they typically fail in managing these risks, at least so far. Then you have a third layer of complexities, which is the accounting. Typically, the accounting rules refer to events that are clearly determinable, right? You have a good that is handed over, the title passes from entity A to entity B in a very clear way. You have a physical transfer. But when it comes to emissions, you don't have a physical asset, right? It is a right, and there's a risk that of double counting that is very well known to practitioners, whereby the same right can be sold several times, or similar type of malpractices, which brings us to the solution, like the silver bullet, which is regulation. Now, regulation is obviously a very the strength and the weakness of any sort of process, right? And if we start and if we see how regulations are being shaped, and we see who is pushing for which regulations, you see that there are conflicts of interest already looming, like some of the largest polluters, like data centers, are trying actively to influence regulatory bodies like Amazon, Meta, Google, etc. So that doesn't look good, right? I mean, is this like, do we want to create a market to remove a negative externality, or we want to just create a market to entertain the externalities? A lot of markets actually are meant to entertain. Like you have a price, so you create the incentive for the externality to remain, but you don't really want to remove it, right? So, and then finally, you do a sense check by talking to the market players. And I was this week meeting with the head of carbon trading of one of the largest trading houses here in Geneva. And in a nutshell, the message is voluntary carbon markets are dead, with a few exceptions, but already we're talking about 2% of 100%. So it's going to be 2% of 2%. We're talking about a minuscule sort of phenomenon, which is unlikely to have an impact. So nevertheless, there have been examples of emission reductions which have been successful. If we rewind to the 80s, when the environmental movement started gaining traction after the 70s and the late 60s, one of the main issues that I remember very well is, sorry, I'm going a little bit off. Basically, it's sulfur sulfur H2S, right? Which was the cause of acid rains, etc. The same institutions sat around the table. They decided for a ban, and they achieved bans on a reduction by law on specifications on transportation fuels, road fuels, shipping fuels, maritime fuels. So to wrap up, I believe that the voluntary carbon markets are unlikely to play a role in the decarbonization of the economy. They might play a role as a market dimension, but negligible, unfortunately. Methane is neglected in terms of priorities, but it's much more relevant as a greenhouse emission. Creating a market for negative externalities gives the negative externalities a reason to exist and survive and potentially strengthen, because at the moment you make it very, very cheap, people just say, okay, it's cheap, the market is always right, I keep polluting. And finally, carbon, which is probably the most important point, carbon mechanisms are an indirect attempt to tackle the real fundamental issue of energy efficiency or energy intensity, which is now picking up the attention of the international organizations. So maybe, hopefully, it will be sort of reinterpreted in the light of energy intensity and efficiency. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marco. So we've heard from Florian that voluntary carbon markets have a potential to help for carbon removal and decarbonization, particularly in supply chains, under the caveat of the right institutions. But of course, Florian said that voluntary carbon markets are booming. Now we've heard from Marco that voluntary carbon markets are dying, and that the market is fragmented, storage of underlying assets is difficult, accounting is challenging. So let's hear from Andy now and see if under what conditions can we achieve success, and is there a middle ground? So Andy, I hand it to you.
Thank you. Now hopefully my screen is coming up. Did that work? Okay. Well, first of all, we can have these abstract discussions about carbon markets and so forth, and we throw in there sort of the 2-degree limit. And let's all remind ourselves what the 2-degree limit is. It's basically the point at which the equilibrium for the planet is no ice at the poles, where we go into a non-ice age. We're right now in an ice age. We're not in a period of glaciation, but we're in a period of ice age. And we go back to a much, much warmer planet in the future. That doesn't affect us immediately because, personally, I'll probably be gone, but it has a big effect. So we're talking about something that I think is extremely important. So we need some way to reduce carbon methane, which is, Marco says, 30 times CO2 in terms of its impact per pound. All right. So now that I've said that, putting a broader picture on it, I want to first put a caveat on, which is this is not really my area. This is a little bit of my background. I've been involved in energy and energy efficiency and climate issues, first as an engineer years and years ago. And then I've done a lot of work on self-regulation, responsible care, equator principles, ISO 14000. And I've looked at measurement, the company called Innovating, which then went on to become part of MSCI and does a lot of their things. And I've been part of the organization that started the Alliance for Corporate Alliance Research on Corporate Sustainability. But nowhere in there do you see carbon or really climate. So I'm coming at this from more of an institutional perspective. Okay. And as the old guy, I get to sit back and say, okay, can we look at this sort of the basics? Because, that's what I'm able to do. So the good here is a very, very funny good, right? So you're buying a reduction, not a good per se, but a reduction. And that reduction is a contribution to a common good. So we already know that it's very difficult to get people to contribute to commons. And here is a case where you're going to buy credit for contributing to something to the common good. So already that sounds hard to do. Then it's a credence credit. It's a credence good. That is, unlike many of the goods that we buy that are experience goods, you buy the coffee mug and then you realize after the fact, okay, it works or it doesn't work. This you buy and you never know whether it was real. You're relying on someone else to claim, to prove to you that it's real, but you'll never know. Then it's also a non-rival good, which makes it also very complicated, which is Marco could presumably sell me a forest to reduce to absorb the carbon that I'm emitting, and then turn around and sell that forest to someone else. And we'd have no way of knowing that he didn't do that unless there was some kind of system in place. So we will need a self-regulatory system, because this is voluntary carbon markets, not government carbon markets. Because first of all, it's going to certify and enforce the property right to the public good. So it's going to say, you have this credit, it's for this much of the public good, we certify it, and we enforce it. We're going to prevent anyone from ever using it or doing anything with it. They have to certify the quality of it, which Marco had already mentioned is really difficult. How much was really absorbed over what time period and so forth. And the probability that it'll be burned down in a forest fire or be sold or something like that. So you have to have the property right, certification for it. Then you're going to have a system that penalizes non-compliance. So if people cheat, you'd have to have some way that you're going to tell them you cheated, you're being penalized in some way. And you're going to have to prevent people who didn't buy good credits, maybe made up credits, from claiming they have credits. So you have to prevent non-certifiers from claiming the rights. These are all difficult things to do. They are sometimes done, though, and they are done by these things called self-regulatory organizations, and those come in 3 different forms. What I call benevolent cartels, that is a bunch of groups get together and let's all improve. Certifiers that say these people have done something better and they're certified, and then pools that are grouped together and they innovate by sharing information. Now, I know that's not exactly on target here because we're really mostly talking about the certifiers, but I want to bring up a point, which is a lot of the self-regulatory organizations out there are mixes. So let me stop for a second. Remember, if we're going to have this market for this complicated good you can't see and verify, we need some kind of regulation in place. It's not government regulation, but it's going to have to be some other regulating organization. What kind of organizations exist out there? How well do they work? Here are a bunch. And at the very top, you have the Institute for Nuclear Power Operators. And basically, that's one of these cartels. Let's all get together and improve our performance so that we don't have an accident, which would then maybe cause a situation where nuclear power was banned, as it was in Germany. Then you have certifiers like the Forestry Stewardship Council to get together and say, all right, this wood is grown in a particular kind of way. Then you have what I call information pools, and I'm throwing them in there, but though I don't know as much about them, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, which holds bunches of meetings and they exchange information on best practices and so forth. But within these groups, you often have mixes. Like I studied responsible care, which was formed after Bhopal, the tragic accident in India, to improve performance in chemical industry, which both certified adoption of behaviors and was a cartel. And one of the things that we kind of discovered is it was behaving more like a cartel than a certifier. Or you have the National Association of Realtors in the United States. You've seen that this is supposed to be an organization that was certifying that your realtor was knowledgeable and knew how to do things, but it turned out it was really a cartel. It was basically raising prices to home buyers. And of course, we have in the carbon area, we have something like the gold standard, which is supposed to be some kind of standard or certification so that we know that the good that we're buying is real. Now, you can see that a lot of these things, some of these things work somewhat. I think the INPO works. Responsible care has not worked. This one's turned out to be a cartel. Equator principles, no one really knows. Forestry Stewardship Council works, we think, pretty well, but it's very hard to know. So we've got these kind of mixes of organizations that are going to have to solve our problem here. And remind you, this is what they're going to have to do. To make them credible and work and effective, this is my list. Stolen partially from Eleanor Ostrom, but this is my list. First of all, they're going to have to feasible and credible monitoring. They're going to have to be able to go out and monitor all the time what's happening on the ground. You have to know that forest continues to grow forever. And you have to have, and this is stolen from Eleanor Ostrom, graduated sanctions. One of the things we know about self-regulatory organizations, if you only have like the nuclear option, throw the person out or some big thing, it never happens. You're afraid to do it. So you need some way of ratcheting up the penalty. You need some way that the stakeholders reward the certification, which is even an issue here. What is the motivation for doing this? If it's just branding, it may not be sufficient. There's got to be some reason that you get like a sales winning benefit or something like that. Then here's another one. You need a reason why the people who do it perform better than the people who don't. And that could be a big issue here, because you could imagine that if this is costly to do, it creates a competitive advantage for the people that don't do it. They may be part from a different kind of stakeholders and no one really cares. So they get a competitive advantage. And then finally, as things change, because it's going to change continually, we're going to keep, as Marco said, there's new information coming in all the time. we're going to keep having to change the rules. You're going to have some system within this that adjusts the rules over time. So those are all really, really challenging problems in an already challenging space here. And then I'll leave you with one last thought. I hope I haven't gone on for too long. The promise of self-regulation is often used to forestall government regulation. And so one of the most fascinating research that I know out there is by a woman named Anne-Christine Bergquist, who's looked at pressure for, believe it or not, climate regulation in the 70s and 80s. And the response from business was always, don't worry about it, we'll do it voluntarily. We'll do it through self-regulation. And then David Posen, who used to be the dean of law school at Columbia University, has written one showing that a lot of transparency and voluntary regulation in the United States was used to forestall more aggressive regulation. So my overall point is complicated good here, difficult to form the self-regulatory organization that runs it, and we have to be careful that the self-regulatory organization, the promise of this, doesn't forestall more meaningful action. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for taking us back to the basics and also walking us through that. I think also you did an excellent summary so that I don't need to summarize also what you said. So I will actually start already the rebuttals now. And since we allowed Florian to go first last time, we'll allow Marco to go first on the rebuttals, and then Florian, and then again Andy as the middle ground. So Marco, we'll start with you to reflect on what you just heard from Florian and Andy, and to continue the debate.
Yes, so I think that the picture, I mean, my take on what I've heard from Florian and from Andy is that there is a desire to do something good for the planet, and that's laudable, because obviously there's an acknowledgement that certain things have gone wrong. There is an understanding of possible solutions. Equally, I believe that focusing on carbon actions is gonna disappoint. I think that the side of the voluntary carbon markets in particular is that it gives the sense that everyone can contribute. Potentially, you know, even as a household levels, for people with a garden or something, they can contribute in their own backyards. At national levels, I was talking with top managers of a Saudi energy company, well known, and they were looking for projects, and as they were sort of scanning for opportunities, they realized that they could do it in Saudi Arabia. So they focused on mangrove, basically rewilding or repopulating in their own country. So every country actually has the key to solutions, right? That's for me the biggest benefit of what we've experienced in the last 9 years. Where I think the initiatives grinds to a halt is the fact that it is not a social event. It's not. There is no asset to be traded. It is a regulated market. Certification is one of the most. If you're not a trader, you might not understand what I'm about to say. But I can tell you that even in something as physical as metals or oil, you can cheat. You can cheat even if you use the best standards, even if you use the best companies. There's always a way to cheat, because the temptation of making money is so big that out of 8 billion people, you will always find a clever one who will, create a situation which damages the market reputation. So it's never a sustainable solution, particularly when the asset is not even tangible. And again, and my last point that I was trying to make before is that actually the issue is energy. It is the amount of energy that we use and waste because we have an energy system which is fundamentally redundant and inefficient. The root cause of global warming and CO2 emissions are an externality deriving from the fact that we use a huge amount, certain countries, a huge amount of energy compared to others, and so the issue should be shifted on energy. And with energy, there are examples, successful examples, like in Italy, there was the white certificates. White certificates, like the carbon credits, they had as a goal the reduction of the increase of energy efficiency, basically. So companies that would maintain the same output with a lower input of energy, they would fulfill these credits. These are, for me, schemes that make much more sense tackle the challenges that we're discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, I let Florian respond to that. Florian, you have 5 to 7 minutes, so take your time.
Okay, perfect. I mean, all very good points. I mean, maybe first on some points that Marco mentioned. Of course, this is a debate, so some of them may be. I mean, I think we are now in a phase where we can have a more open discussion. I think that, I mean, you mentioned kind of regulation is the silver bullet. Yes, of course. I mean, I think everybody would agree, right? But as I mentioned, I think my point would be, we seem to have a limited regulatory capacity, and we should do everything we can to enhance this regulatory capacity. But right now, it doesn't look like we'll get the level of regulation to the place where we need. Coming back to Andy's question, I mean, 2 degrees are crucial, right? It really matters where we end up at 2 degrees or 3 degrees. There's been just a very scary study on what will happen if the North Atlantic circulation will stop. So we may have like a temperature drop of up to minus 10 degrees to 15 degrees in Western Europe. And this would kill agriculture, basically. So, I mean, just it is crucial, right? It does matter where we end up. But kind of, so back to regulation. So, of course, we need regulation. But I think at the current point, and given this urgency, right, we cannot afford to ignore other things than regulation. And one thing is this huge demand for green products by many people. So, I mean, maybe in any given population, not 50%, vote for green regulation, but you may have 30% of people that care about green products. And that's the allure, right, of kind of green demand, green products, and these private sector action. They don't need majorities on ballots. So, but we have this demand, and I think it's very worthwhile thinking about how can we take this demand and make it to you, kind of put it to use as good as possible. And just that there's been an interesting study done at Zurich. I think it's not yet published. They work with an online retailer, and they figure out that on average, Swiss customers are willing to pay up to 4% of the purchase price to reduce their carbon emissions. I mean, that's just 4%, but you apply this to the kind of the aggregate Swiss consumption, which is not low. I mean, that's quite some money we could use to do useful things. Now, again, is this money currently being used to do useful things? I doubt it in many ways. And I mean, just looking at the current evidence, I mean, there has been a study by ETH Zurich that kind of estimates that only about 12% of all carbon credits were real. Right? So, I mean, there's many things are going wrong for different reasons. I think, I mean, again, to Andy, I think it has to do a lot with your points on self-regulation that you might mention that often are not fulfilled. And then maybe also on the point, I mean, are carbon markets dead? I think many people have, I mean, they have been claimed dead for quite a few times already. They have survived everywhere. I'm also surprised how well they survive. And I think maybe this emission reduction type will die. I don't know, could very well be. But I'm pretty sure is that there will be a substantial market for carbon removals. And we don't need to think about these complex things, additionality. If you just pump carbon physically into the soil, right? That's pretty straightforward. Also, the accounting is straightforward. But a lot of the potential for sequestration lies in agriculture and forestry, which is, again, inherently hard to measure. There's additionality concerns. I think we should think about how to do these markets. And then maybe to end this point, I think you are exactly the perfect expert to have in the discussion because you're an expert in self-regulation, right? So far, this has been a market that has been left on its own. We completely left it to industry to regulate itself. So I think it's a prime example of how self-regulations can work or failed to work so far, I think. And I think my question is, I mean, you pointed out all these criteria. I really question whether self-regulation is enough to get carbon markets going. I doubt it, honestly. And what I'm quite hopeful is that we could regulate carbon markets over unfair commercial practice regulation, right? And also, I mean, this connected to point, I don't think voluntary carbon markets trade emissions. It's not about emission, it's about substantiation of environmental claims, right? The right to make, can you buy something in order to be allowed to make an environmental claim on your product? And I think that's, there is a lot of regulation on claims generally. If you have any product, any attribute, you claim something, that's a huge legal system. Companies sue each other all the time because they say, this company claims something that's not really true. Consumer claim sue companies. But environmental claims have been left out of this debate so far, and that's changing, right? So there's a lot of EU regulation, for example, that kind of makes regulations on environmental claims strict. And I like this approach, not saying how carbon markets need to work, but making clear criteria on what needs to be what level of evidence you need to bring to the table if you want to make an environmental claim. Like, for example, this product is carbon neutral or carbon reduced, or my company has a net zero ambition, right? And you use carbon credits, right? So I have quite some hope for some regulatory invention that isn't like a carbon pricing. I mean, we need that, but I mean, we could achieve a lot in kind of capturing this green demand for better if we have more regulation on market practices with regards to environmental claims and kind of the level of evidence you need to bring to not getting sued by consumers or your competitors. But with that, I think I would like to hand over to Andy.
Okay. I'll let you go ahead.
So, so what I hear from Marco and Florian is a variety of things, and essentially we're all struggling for a solution, and we don't really know what the solution is. Marco is pointing out the very important thing, I think, which is that people cheat, right? Cheating is going to happen if there's a reason, and you need a way to prevent that from happening. And his solution is, okay, well, let's go to a measurement or focus on something that's easier to measure and understand: energy, just energy inputs. There are issues associated with that, which we can get into, but that would be a way to go. And then, I'm sorry to say this, Florian, but I think you played all sides. You basically started off saying, the voluntary markets can work. There's hope here. We shouldn't give up on them. It's a good thing. And then you turned around and you said, well, yes, but then we need some regulation, which I think is also true. And then you said, well, maybe the tort system can work it out. Maybe it can happen just through the legal system, which is kind of covering, I think, all the bases. But we see the problem, which is we know there's got to be, cheating's going to happen. We're going to know there's going to have to be some way of recognizing when it occurs and punishing it, either through the legal system or regulatory system or something. And we don't know how to accomplish that. And I'll just add in again, just repeat my big fear. Self-regulation has been used over and over and over again to forestall real government regulation. So what I worry about is that our hope, our struggling to find a solution here just prevents real action. I hear you that we can't, get government regulations very, very difficult to achieve. And so therefore the answer is always, well, maybe we can do it ourselves. But often that ends up just being, a smokescreen. And so I think we got to make sure that doesn't happen here. I'm done.
Okay. Florian, do you want to quickly rebuttal to that, or you're okay?
I just want to add one point. I think, like, for me, that's the core point, the one that Andy just said, right? We know that regulation is the most effective solution. we have this kind of second best voluntary industry-driven solutions. They might work, they might not. But if they kind of lead to less regulation, we certainly have a problem, right? So we should, work on kind of not allowing that. But to me, that's an open question. Does this really happen? I mean, it certainly was happening in some cases, but is this happening? And to me, I think that's an open academic question. That there should be way more research on kind of the interplay. At least, I mean, I have been doing research on this on sustainable investing, where we basically showed the kind of the option to invest green doesn't lead people to engage less politically for climate change. If anything, it does make them to engage more, right? And so I also would wonder what happens with carbon markets, right? Is it really that the option to offset emissions leads company to, I mean, politicians to have less appetite for regulation? I think, no, I'm really interested in this question. I would like to learn more about that.
You have more faith in humanity than I do. I have to say, your quote about Swiss customers willing to pay 4% more. What I find fascinating about this, linking both Marco and you, Marco points out people cheat. I forget, but it's something like 25% of all products, clothing products that are sold in Italy are fake, so that there's this tendency to, put a brand on. So you've got, right, that tendency to cheat. And then sticking with clothing, what's the largest clothing company in the world right now? Shein. Shein is the opposite of climate responsible, right? It's throwaway clothing where you buy it, it's $10, you wear it 3 times and then you throw it away. And so you're telling me that there's this green consumer that's going to drive things, but what it looks like really is driving consumers right now is hyper fast fashion, which is throwaway fashion. So I find it hard to square this notion you're going to pay 4% more with people buying this stuff that they wear twice.
Maybe that's the difference between Switzerland and the US consumer. Yeah, right.
Maybe you Swiss are better.
Shall we? Oh, maybe not. It's true.
I'm going to look up sales by Shein in Switzerland right now. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll let you come back to me on that one. Shall we open up the floor? I know we have quite a few experts with us here as well, and we've left quite a bit of time. So we have 30 minutes for Q&A. So it would be great if you have a question, ideally just turn on your camera and ask it. If you don't want to turn on your camera, you can also ask the question in the chat. So any questions to our debaters? I obviously have questions. Okay, I'll start with mine. I think it builds on what Florian said before Andy rebutted. So it's this idea of whether pricing is the way or pricing is not the way, and what are the alternatives. There's been a lot of discussion now, and you pulled up some of the recent news articles as well. If VCM, what is beyond VCM? So we've achieved voluntary carbon markets to date. Now what happens next? And is there a middle ground? Is it command and control? What needs to be done, and so forth? And I think we started going in that direction to ask this question, and maybe you can just continue building on that. To anyone. I was maybe initially to Florian, but to anyone, this question. Like, what are the alternatives, I guess? And I think you mentioned some of them: regulation, legal, command and control. If we go to a very top-down approach, is there anything else?
It's a good question, right? I mean, innovation certainly has a role to play, right? And
I don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer, but to some extent, I think it's important to leave the private sector with some leeway. I mean, in order to innovate, but I mean, the question is always what comes out. I mean, just generally, I mean, I having been talking, I mean, that's a bit off topic maybe, but one study that made me really hopeful and even a bit less pessimistic. A colleague here at SAFE Frankfurt, they did a global survey on the political attitudes towards more climate regulation. So didn't just ask the usual suspects in Europe, UA. It just went global, and I think 150 countries or more. They kind of had a strong survey on kind of do people want more? Do you expect your governments to do more, right? And would they be willing to pay, a substantial amount of money if governments would do more? And to my surprise, they found across the globe, like more than 50%, like I think in either 60 to 70% agree government should do more. And most people also again, more than 50% would be willing to pay some of their fortunes and income if that would happen. The interesting thing is they consistently strongly underestimate how many other people, other citizens are willing to pay that. So I think thinking about along these lines, I think it's certainly something that's really interesting, kind of how can we overcome this kind of gridlock that we have in the political debate, right? Given that we have a broad concern, but it doesn't seem to translate in level of regulation we need. What is the reason for this?
We have 2 more questions, unless Andy, you want to jump in on that one, or Marco, or
Yeah,
there's some in the chat.
I think that I want to this is food for thoughts, right? I was at an event last week where people from the media industry were gathering experts in basically social media, etc., serving some of the largest organizations in Switzerland and abroad, and mostly relatively young people, all sort of environmentally conscious more than average, let's say. And I had a long discussion with one of them who made a very interesting point that he tries to live his life, by the book, trying to minimize carbon footprint, not traveling too much, eating vegan, and not basically using the airplanes too often, taking public transport. And then he, the moment he added the carbon footprint of his online activities, he said, every time I make a query on my sort of software, I I consume a huge amount of CO2. So and then he said, so what am I really supposed to do, right? Today, if you want a job, what's on offer is, for example, AI-based technologies because it's fancy, it's where hope lies, etc., etc. But all these technologies, they're so ineffective and inefficient, and they keep getting and technologies with similar carbon footprint or energy intensity, they keep coming up as the next mirage, the next hope, the next belief, etc., etc. There's something fundamentally fundamentally questionable around this sort of mechanism of generation of ideas that have a huge carbon footprint. While we try to solve the existing ones, I think it should be probably easier to handle the upcoming ones because they are not yet fully structured. But apparently, it's almost the other way around. The ones that are upcoming, they're fully deregulated and they have a lot of room for acting in the gray, particularly along the dimension of carbon footprint. And then the fingers are pointed against the established players, emerging countries, etc., etc. So there is a political dimension in the carbon markets that should not be underestimated. We should remember that the effect of carbon dioxide on temperatures was detected almost 200 years ago. So for the last 150 years, you can say no one said anything. But the moment through offshoring industries, the pollutants became, the developing countries, and all of a sudden, the concern on decarbonizing as sort of hit the headlines and keeps hitting the headlines. if you expand this debate by not having only sort of speakers from the Western world and including also speakers from the so-called global South, you would probably have a different flavor altogether, and you would probably appreciate that some of the complexities are well beyond regulation, because for some of these countries, it's a matter of stepping up from maybe not the poverty line, but something relatively close to it. And so there's a lot at stake for them.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. And that's a good shout on the diversity angle there as well in terms of the global South. Andrew, do you want to come in?
Well, I see we have two questions, and I have an answer and a half. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, is now increasing the amount of methane reporting. And so that will be good. Methane, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Florian, is supposed to be reported as part of your global warming CO2es to the CDP if you report to the CDP, and it should be included in your ESG analysis if they're there. But of course, those are bad and voluntary, and really it's very hard to figure out what the ground truth is there. And in terms of markets and innovation, this is not really my area, but my understanding is, I think this is the key question, because to be honest with you, I think we're going to get there by getting something that is low CO2 that's cheaper, and then we're going to roll it out because it's cheaper. And if you think about a lot of the world, they're more interested in having electricity and refrigeration and air conditioning and reliable power than they are really about climate change. So somehow we have to get something that's cheaper. And I think stability in regulation is as important as strictness and as well, but also this just sort of reliability and stability. We often have change every 2 or 3 years in the United States. I don't know, more experts on innovation that want to jump in. Florian, do you have anything?
I mean, maybe first on the methane, but what I find quite exciting is that there's a couple of initiatives to measure methane emissions with satellites. I believe Google has just launched a new service. So expect a kind of more or less real-time measurement of methane will kind of strongly influence the quality of accounting, because now you have kind of an external valid source to track corporate statements, which I find really interesting. I think on CO2 it will be really hard, but methane seems to be way easier to track from space. And also, of course, I mean, I agree with Andy on innovation. I think voluntary carbon markets are currently playing a very important role in innovating carbon capture and mainly carbon sequestration technology. So I don't know how scalable that is. What happens currently is that large, I would say, high margin companies like large IT companies, they have launched a couple of initiatives that so-called takeoff facilities that say, I mean, we're willing to pay really high prices for anybody that can, promise us to deliver certain reduction sequestration amounts in the future. We give them some time to do so. So, I mean, they artificially create a price, right, for sequestration, which now allows kind of many startups to scale their products, because immediately they have a business case. I mean, the question is kind of, how sustainable is that? I mean, will this really create a market that goes beyond, the money some very high profitable IT companies can spend? But I think currently this small market is driving a lot of innovation in this sector, and I hope this will continue.
Okay. Any further questions? Yes,
I have a
Andrew,
question.
go.
I want to say something outrageous, because I realize we're down to 8 people or something. So I can go ahead and be outrageous. All right, here's my claim. I don't think we're going to do it. I think that the probability of us, I mean, you can see us, we're kind of trying to figure out how this is going. We don't have world government. World government scares the pants off of many people. It's very hard to get enacted. Voluntary regulation seems to be very difficult. The only way I see us preventing the 2-degree thing is either some big innovation, right? Suddenly we have nuclear power that's super, super cheap or something like that, and you can roll it out. Deep geothermal. I keep thinking, oh, maybe deep geothermal will work. Or we're going to dim the planet. And right now, I think the most likely thing is we get to a point where we have a scary situation in the North Atlantic, and we shoot sulfides into the atmosphere and we dim the planet. We have a voluntary volcano. And that's so cheap if you ever look at the numbers. It's like tens of billions of dollars a year, tens of billions of dollars a year to change the temperature of the planet. Do you guys see any way forward?
I would just observing. I think currently there's two things happening that are kind of unexpected, right? So on one hand, it seems that a lot of, especially the renewable energy technology, growth of renewables, of batteries, so the growth exceeds most predictions we had. But this transition somehow seems to happen faster than we expected. So it's so hard to this policy projection of the IPCC. Who knows, right? Maybe it will be faster than we thought. Some indication. At the same time, right? If we look at the physical side, at what client scientists are telling us, currently our planet is way above most of the simulations or the model outcomes when it comes to temperature, to ocean surface temperature, to many indicators. So it's really hard to say where we're heading right now.
I would say it's a desperate idea to dim the planet. I think this is something that, I had not heard about it really. I'm looking it up now, and I think I would really hope that we can find another solution before moving in that direction. So, for me, that sounds it is indeed an outrageous remark, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the solution is otherwise, unless there's a massive behavior change among all of us, basically. What were you going to say, Andy?
I suppose it's disparate, but one of the reasons why climate change is accelerated is perversely that China cleaned up and stopped having as much coal and shooting sulfur into the atmosphere, and they de-dimmed because the planet, we've done some planetary dimming by accident just from having lots of coal plants. So, and volcanoes dim the planet all the time when we had it. So the experiments in a way have been done. I agree, it's crazy, but Florian is talking about the North Atlantic current turning around. Here's another way of saying it. For most of our lives, climate is not going to have much of an effect. It's going to have a tiny little effect. Where it has a big effect is if one of these disasters happens, right? The North Atlantic current stops. At that point, I think that's what we're going to do. And I think that's the way it's going to happen. We're going to keep going until crisis. And then we're going to have a technical fix, which is, I think, what we've seen in lots of previous, environmental problems.
I don't think the dimming is easy fix, right? There has been some interesting studies the challenge. It may be feasible to some extent, right? To put some stuff in the atmosphere like we used to do with coal to dim it down, but to keep, right? The global temperature is in equilibrium, right?
But you only have to dim the planet a little tiny bit.
But you have to do it all the time. You have to keep, put that stuff continuously, right? And the moment where you fail to do so, right? So the impact of climate change is kind of the change in temperature times, the duration. Like fast changes are really that's what's creating all the harm. And there could be a scenario where we, dim the thing, there's a bit the atmosphere on and on and on until we have a big economic crisis and we stop. And I think then we would have like the entire climate disasters within a few years, which could be kind of even more disastrous than anything we have experienced. I mean, at least that's one argument why we should probably be very careful with dimming approaches on large scales.
Plus the side effects in the long term, I mean, I don't think we understand what those would be, and
No.
we might be, doing
But
something
there's
even
side
worse.
effects
Yeah.
from climate change. I mean, the thing is, I hear you guys. We're talking about a global experiment on climate, right?
Right.
We're doing it. And the question is, I mean, how do we govern at the global scale when the costs are so high? I mean, if you look at self-regulation, one of the things Ostrom says is if you have equal impacts, it's much easier to form something. We don't have that with climate. We have the South, which wants to grow and should grow, and from a welfare point of view is better off having some coal power plants than having no electricity. And so at some point, I don't see how we regulate this system. I don't see how we get there, other with a technological miracle or some global intervention like dimming the planet. Have I driven the rest of the people off hill? I might have even gained one. All right, I'm done. Yeah.
This is fun. We should continue this
All right.
discussion over drinks, I think.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you very much to the three of you. And I'm sure this will be recorded, put online, and we'll probably get more views there. And we'll probably hear about this last bit of the discussion later from other people. But I think this was a huge learning curve for me. I do think that this is not spoken about enough. And particularly in management and strategy, this has not penetrated deeply yet. I think that it's still siloed to certain parts of the academic discourse. So it would be great to open this up and open up this discussion more. So thank you very much, Andy, Marco, Florian, Esther, and the Global Strategy Interest Group for letting us put this on.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks a lot for organizing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.